Die wahren Ursachen der natürlichen Wirkungen und Begebenheiten sind oftmals von den Gründen darauf gefußen, von den Versuchen.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. I'm delighted to be speaking. I am very sorry that I can't be there. I know I'm missing some great discussion. This title is a bit different than the announced title. Also the talk, I came into this still thinking of Du Châtelet as a relatively neglected figure. And then I found, oh, there's actually more and more and more useful secondary literature out there. So I was hoping to do more with Kant. I was hoping to do more with the secondary literature, and I was hoping to do it last week. And we had a big storm in Austin, as you might have heard. So the city shut down, schools shut down, power shut down, internet shut down. So this is again a bit less than I might have hoped, but I hope it'll still be worthwhile. So the focus is more on Du Châtelet. Oh, let's see, how do I get these to advance? Oh, now how do I get to go back? Right, thanks. So I'm going to just give some background to try to set up the issues. That's actually all the Kant that will be in this talk. And then look at a couple of different ways that Du Châtelet applies her principle of sufficient reason. What is striking to me is that there seems to be a strong presumption in Du Châtelet that sufficient reasons will have a successive structure, which I think we can comfortably call a temporal structure. And I want to bring out what I find especially striking example of that. And this seems to have some implications for her metaphysics of time. So I want to close by talking about that. What I have to say I intend as fairly speculative. I take myself more to be kind of raising questions than putting forward a very solid view of things. So my starting point would be Kant's pre-critical new elucidation. Erin has a very nice paper on this, which I can recommend. And there's also a very helpful and influential discussion in Beatrice Longinus. So what I think is very well established is that in this paper, Kant distinguishes among various kinds of grounds. And he articulates a principle of sufficient reason, which applies to grounds of all of these different kinds. So grounds of knowing, grounds of existing, what gets translated as grounds of essential determinations, grounds of becoming. And he articulates along the way a principle of succession, which you can see up here on the slide. This is not the only manifestation of the PSR that you find in this work. It's just the one that ends up postulating a sort of temporal structure of causes or reasons. And then I also have a little discussion from Beatrice Longinus's paper. What I wanted to bring out from this is that this principle applies, the principle of succession, that is, this version of the PSR, applies to grounds of becoming. He defends it by talking about what's required for the becoming to be of a state. Again, that's not the only kind of ground he discusses, and so that's not the only way in which he wants to apply the PSR in this particular pre-critical work. And of course, that changes in the critical period. So Longinus has observed that in the second analogy, which Kant says is his proof of the PSR insofar as the PSR is defensible, the principle that gets proved looks very much like the principle of succession. And what is striking about this, so just continuing to quote Longinus there, what's striking about this is that the other kinds of grounds have dropped out of the picture. There is no, it seems, for critical Kant, there's no defensible PSR applying to those. And it's an interesting question. Why? Longinus gives I think, a very compelling answer. I don't have my own answer to offer here. I just wanted to bring out, again, that in Kant's development, we get this restriction or narrowing of the PSR from applying broadly across all those kinds of grounds to applying to what you might call time-indexed grounds, so that explanations in accordance with the PSR have a kind of temporal structure. And the reason I wanted to bring this out is that it seems that we see something like this in Du Châtelet also. So to begin, her first formulation of the PSR in Institution, what I take to be the official formulation, and this is very open-ended as to what kinds of things have grounds or what sorts of grounds they could have. Everything must have a sufficient reason, that is to say, a reason that makes us understand why this thing is what it is, rather than something completely different. And just to bring out the open-endedness of that, we could contrast it with a formulation from one of her sources, the Leibniz-Clark correspondence, where Leibniz says what kinds of things need sufficient reasons, right? Things existing, events happening, truths taking place. Just by the way, Du Châtelet's formulation includes that the reason should make us understand why this thing is what it is, rather than something completely different. It's in that way contrastive. I thought it's worth pointing out that earlier in the correspondence, Leibniz gives a formulation that's also contrastive in the same manner. So the what I think of as the temporal structuring of explanation in accordance with the PSR, it seems to me that this comes out fairly early on, still in chapter 1. She is contrasting geometry, a domain in which all truths are necessary, so it's the principle of contradiction that's in play, with the domain in which the PSR is in play. And that's where it is possible for a thing to be in several states. And so what we need a reason for is why this thing is in some state rather than the other states that are possible for it. And this is just striking because, you know, this seems like it's an introductory context, right? She's trying to explain where the PSR applies, what it does for us. And she does this in terms of the states that things enter into. So what Kant, in that earlier work called Ratio Fiendi, she doesn't bring in here the idea that just the existence of something should also have a sufficient reason. Also striking, so in the second chapter, in the argument for the existence of God, you know, there's this proof in numbered paragraphs. She starts out talking about the existence of things as something that needs reason. And then there's a sudden switch in the fourth paragraph. I take it that the role of this particular piece of the argument is to show that there aren't any necessary beings except for God. So we're supposed to show that all the other beings are contingent. And this is shown by arguing that there is succession in the states that these things enter into. So nothing is necessarily in one state. Everything is successive. This is her way, it seems, of spelling out how it is that there is only contingency in all the beings that surround us. And this is, we see this also in a slightly later paragraph from that same chapter. Here, she brings in one additional consideration to show that the world we see cannot be the necessary being. It has continual succession that's still, it seems to me, in the spotlight. She mentions here also that it's composed of parts. Sorry, I mean, just to a little bit more. These, I take it, are the features of the world for which we need a sufficient reason. That is to say, the features that show it to be contingent. And again, there's a sort of temporal structure that's coming in there in the explanandum. So moving on to chapter 6 on time, just again, another context in which it's coming to be or coming into some particular state that seems to call for an explanation. And again, there's, it seems to me a very interesting shift in the discussion. So in section 97, the aim is to account for how we form the idea of time. We do have this tendency to think of it as an absolute being. This comes about because, as she says, we pay attention to the continuous succession of several beings, and we conceive of the existence of the first as distinct from that of the second. So here it seems perhaps as though we're talking about existence, right, rather than becoming. But when she goes on to give an example to clarify this, the beings that succeed each other in existence, this is not, we normally think of it, I think, as the popping into existence of an object. Rather, this is an object's coming into a certain state. So we're not talking about the existence of a body, full stop, but we're talking about the existence of the body at a point. Again, these are the beings that we observe as succeeding one another. So it's just, and I think, striking. And in her argument for the principle of continuity, also later on in chapter 7, it seems to be just taken for granted that if we want to explain, so here, I'm sorry, here the temporal structuring is on the side of the explanans rather than the explanandum. If we want to explain how it is that a thing comes into a state, it's taken for granted that that explanation lies in a preceding state. In the argument for principle of continuity, that's to show that it lies in the preceding state, that there could be no states interposed between that state that explains and the state that we're trying to explain. So based on these kinds of examples, I would say that the applications of the PSR to changes of state are most prominent. That's not the only way in which the PSR is applied. So one illustrative example of a different kind, here we are just looking for a reason of existence. So what Kant would call ratio existendi rather than fiendi. If someone asked why there were watches, the explanation would be, and so we're talking about the existence of the watch. And here what explains that is not something that's temporally structured. It's just the existence of other things, in particular things that are not watches. Okay, so I next wanted to focus in on one context in which this temporal structuring is, I think, really striking. This is section 44 from chapter 3, and the aim is to contrast the simple possibility of modes and their actuality. The essence of something is sufficient to explain the simple possibility of its modes, but to explain their actuality, we need some further explanatory material. So the example is the given position of the parts of a clock. This is meant to be something that does not depend simply on its essence. And here it is just asserted that the reason for its actuality comes from the preceding position. It's a little more complicated than that because she wants to allow that the explanation for the actuality of the mode could be within the being itself, whose mode it is, in which case it would belong to the antecedent modes, or it could belong in an external being. So to illustrate how an external being comes into the explanation, we have the supposition that an external agent could make the wheels of the clock turn, and then the explanation would lie both in that external being and in the antecedent states of the being itself. And I found this particularly striking because if you're asking about the position of, say, a particular gear of the clock or the position of the hands on the wheel at a given moment, it seems that that could be explained, perhaps should be explained in terms of their relative positions with respect to the other parts. If you're talking about the position of a gear, you'd think that that maybe gets explained in terms of the position of a different gear that turns that one. And the following example in section 44 concerns the position of the arm of a human body. So here, what we're looking for an explanation of is a particular part of a system. Because this question wouldn't come up, I take it, if you were asking about the position of all of the parts of the watch taken together at a single time. But again, if you're just asking about the position of some part or other, it seems we do get an explanation for that in the locations of the other parts. In chapter 8, the point here is to explain what it means to talk about the internal state of a being. Here she does talk about the internal state of a watch. So I think that consists in the particular position that its parts have. That is determined by the positioning of the wheels with respect to one another. So in this instance, it looks as though the explanation for the position of the wheel or the gear or the hand or what have you, that is just a synchronic explanation in terms of how the other parts are disposed with respect to it. And again, that makes it very striking, I think, really, that in these other contexts, in particular in section 44, it seems to be taken for granted that the explanation has to be diachronic. So one suggestion as to why this would be is that sufficient reasons are supposed to be contrastive. They're supposed to explain why this thing is what it is rather than something completely different. In this case, we're trying to explain why this particular position is the mode that is actual, in contrast to the other positions that are possible modes for this watch. So if that's what's at issue, then maybe that does go to show why the explanation has to be diachronic rather than synchronic. Because if we tried to give one of those synchronic explanations, just in terms of the relative position of the other parts, then I take it we'd face the same question over again. Yes, but so, we're talking about this gear that's being pushed by that gear. We say this gear is in this position because that gear is in that position. Question then, why is that gear in that position and not any of the other positions possible? So we would be left with just a slightly different version of the question we had asked in the first place. And that would mean then that we haven't gotten the sufficient reason that we were looking for. Sorry, so this is just spelling out what I was trying to say a moment ago. I take it, though, that if we appeal to the preceding state, then we do get this explanation of why the gear is now in this position and not in any of the other positions. This is the one position into which it could move given what its previous state was. So that's my suggestion. Again, that explanations in accordance with the PSR are contrastive. That's my suggestion as to why those explanations would turn out to be diachronic, at least, when we're talking about things like watches. And the next point I wanted to make is that this seems to hold, that is, that explanations in accordance with the PSR are diachronic. This seems to hold at the level of simple beings. So focusing in now on chapter 7, the explanandum here is how that composite beings undergo succession and change and go through these different states. The explanans for that is that the simple beings, in terms of which, that which goes on with the composite beings, is to be explained. Simple beings undergo succession. They go through a succession of states. So the requirement of successiveness, temporal structuring, this holds for simple beings insofar as they explain what we observe in composite beings. And it holds with respect to simple beings themselves. So just as with the watch, the explanation for the state it's in now lies in its preceding states. So also with simple beings, one could ask, what is the explanation for the state of the simple being at this time? And the explanation would lie in the preceding state. So if that's right, that suggests that perhaps space and time are not going to have the same ontological status. Simple beings would themselves have to have a kind of temporally extended existence, whereas there's no requirement that they have a spatially extended existence. And in fact, she explicitly denies that they do. So simple beings, they have no extension. Consequences are that they are indivisible, they have no shape, they have no height, they fill no space, they have no internal motion. But it seems that they do have duration. And in fact, this is also explicitly asserted. So just to be very clear here, it seems to me that the asymmetry arises with respect to whether these things have what you could call in some general sense extension, not specifically spatial extension, but whether their existence extends in time. It does extend, so to speak, in time, not in space. There's a separate question of whether they could have, so to speak, location, again, not specifically spatial location. Could you pin down their existence to an instant of time or to a point in space? It's certainly open to Du Châtelet to hold that they have location in space. The existence of a simple thing is in some way to some point in space. That could be true even if the temporal thing has no extension in some quantity of space. So, so again, I take it to be an asymmetry, at least at the level of having duration versus having extension. Maybe not asymmetry at the level of whether these things are located, so to speak, in space or time. And this view, which it seems Du Châtelet holds, this does land her with a kind of terminological awkwardness. So in one of the passages that we've just looked at, she says that the simple things have no internal motion. That's, in this context, that's because they have no spatial extension. They don't contain any spatial parts that could change their situation relative to one another. But 3 sections later, she does attribute to them a kind of motion in terms of the series of changes that they go through. So I take it in this later passage, we must be using motion in a broader sense, one perhaps familiar from an Aristotelian tradition, as speaking of generally, not specifically of change of location in space. Just pressing this a bit further, if there is this asymmetry, could we see it in her explicit discussion of the ontological status of space and time? And it seems to me that maybe, yes, we do see something like that. So I would say that she more consistently characterizes space as ideal. So one clear statement of that from the chapter on space, she takes herself to have explained the processes by which we form an idea of space and attribute certain properties to it. But the discussion is supposed to show that all of these alleged properties, as well as the being in which we suppose them to exist, have no reality but in the abstractions of our mind. So this seems to be a pretty strong assertion of mind dependence. And it seems to me that we don't quite find that in the chapter on time. So in the passage that was most closely parallel that I could find in the chapter on time, she speaks of time again as being only an abstract being, but she does not say that it gets its reality from, or its reality depends on abstraction by our mind. She says that its reality depends on the things that stand in these relations of succession. So the reference to the mind making its abstraction seems to have dropped out. And in the case of space, which I think maybe illustrates that, to define space as the order of coexisting things. So there's certainly some superficial similarity in that space is defined as an order of coexisting things. Time is defined as an order of successive things. But even here, when she gives this definition of space, she speaks of this resemblance in the manner in which beings coexist. And that's in the context of what we represent to ourselves. So she does say that the coexistence of the several beings produces an order or resemblance of manner. But again, that's all sort of, as it were, bracketed by what we represent to ourselves. And you don't find that kind of bracketing in the time chapter. So what I thought was really a very striking passage. Time is really nothing other than the order of successive beings. One forms the idea of time, in as much as one considers only, sorry, read my own screen here. One considers the order of their succession. So no time without the beings. Again, the reality of time depends on that of the beings, the things, abstract in that sense. Then she goes on to say, there is time as soon as such beings exist. So here there's no reference to our minds, our abstraction. The claim really seems to be that the existence of the beings in presumably succession, right? That's asserted before that. The existence of, sorry, let's just say the successively ordered existence of the beings, that is sufficient for time. It seems. There is, again here, there's no further condition that we have to carry out some mental process of abstracting. So I found that really striking. And my, again, conjecture here is that time has this mind-independent reality that space does not, because the simple things must have, whatever it is that we're talking about, when we're talking about the fundamental level of reality, it must have duration. It must be successively structured. And we know that because of the role it plays in giving the explanation of that which we observe. So what I want to do is link this ontological asymmetry, if in fact it's there, link this ontological asymmetry to the requirement of temporality in giving sufficient explanations. So that was it. Again, I had hoped to have more to say, but the storm did not permit.